She gave birth beneath the blood eclipse, and the baby's curse mark made the entire West cry, or so the whispers would claim, carried on the dust devils that danced across the parched plains. The sky had wept crimson that night, a terrible, beautiful wound bleeding across the indifferent stars. Elara had screamed, not just from the travail of her body, but from a terror that clawed deeper than any physical pain. Alone in a crumbling lean-to, a place scavenged dogs would shun, she had brought forth life as the world above seemed to mimic a cosmic death. The wind, a mournful chorus, had whipped through the gaps in the rotten wood, carrying the scent of rain that never came, only the metallic tang of the blood moon's strange light. And when her daughter lay upon her breast, small and impossibly fragile against the vast, cruel night, Elara had seen it. A mark, etched upon the baby's tender brow, like a sliver of the eclipsed moon itself, dark and stark against her pale skin. It was not a blemish, it was a brand, a sigil of the unnatural hour of her birth. Her heart, already a stone of dread, shattered into 1,000 icy shards. She knew, with a certainty that stole her breath, what this meant. The village of redemption, huddled in the valley below, was a place that clung to piety with the desperation of a drowning man to a splintered log. Their god was a wrathful one, their superstitions as deeply rooted as the ancient oaks that dotted the forbidding hills. The eclipse, they had preached for weeks, was an omen, a sign of displeasure. And now, her child bore its shadow. She had no husband to stand for her, he had ridden off months before, chasing a rumor of gold, leaving her with a swelling belly and promises as empty as the wind. She was an outsider already, her ways too quiet, her gaze too knowing for their comfort. The dawn, when it finally broke, was pale and unforgiving. It brought not relief, but the heavy tread of boots, the murmur of grim voices. They found her, huddled with her newborn, the mark on the child's forehead a beacon in the dim light. The elder, a man whose face was a roadmap of harsh judgments, recoiled as if struck. A curse, he pronounced, his voice a gravelly edict that sealed their fate. Born of the shadow, marked by the shadow, other voices joined, a rising tide of fear and revulsion. Abomination, which child she has brought this upon us? Elara clutched her baby, Lyra she had whispered to the infant in the darkest hour, Lyra of the stars. She tried to speak, to plead, but her throat was a knot of unshed tears and terror. They gave her no chance. They dragged her from the lean-to, her body still weak, her spirit flayed raw. No one offered a hand. No one met her eyes with anything but condemnation. Stones, small at first, then larger, began to fly, not aimed to kill, but to drive, to defile. "Leave this place," the elder commanded. "Take your cursed offspring and never return. The shadow you carry will not taint redemption." She stumbled, Lyra wailing against her, a tiny, piercing cry that seemed to amplify the cruelty of the world. She did not look back. There was nothing to look back to. Only the dust rising from their departing feet, and the heavy, unyielding silence of the wilderness before her. The sun climbed, merciless and hot. Her milk had not yet come, and Lyra's cries grew weaker. Elara's own strength ebbed with every painful step, her heart a hollow drum beating a rhythm of despair. The land stretched out, vast and indifferent, a canvas of baked earth and skeletal trees. This was how she would die, she thought, a pariah, with her cursed child in her arms, another forgotten tragedy swallowed by the unforgiving West. Hope was a word she no longer understood. There was only the sun, the dust, and the tiny, marked face of her daughter, a condemnation etched in flesh. He found her where the scrub met the barren rock, a crumpled heap of calico and despair. Silas had been tracking a stray steer, its path leading him further from his solitary homestead than he usually ventured. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, a stark contrast to the memory of the blood eclipse that still unsettled the air. He was a man of the land, weathered and quiet, his face a testament to solitude and harsh seasons. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, missed little. He saw the bundle in her arms first, then the woman herself, still as death. For a moment, he thought them both gone, another grim discovery in a land that offered few kindnesses. Then, a faint whimper, small and reedy as a newborn bird, reached him. He dismounted, his movements economical, his tall frame casting a long shadow. As he drew closer, he saw the exhaustion etched on her young face, the dirt and tear tracks, the raw scrape on her temple where a stone had found its mark. And then, as she stirred weakly, her protective arm shifting, he saw the child. And the mark. It was a dark, crescent shape on the infant's forehead, stark and unusual. He had heard the whispers from redemption, carried by a passing trapper just days before. Talk of a child born under the blood moon, an ill omen, a curse. The folk of redemption were quick to fear, quick to blame. Silas himself put little store in such things. Life was hard enough without inventing new demons. He'd seen his share of hardship, buried his own young wife and stillborn son years ago, their graves marked by simple wooden crosses on a rise overlooking his cabin. That loss had carved a silence into him that few ever tried to breach. He knelt, his gaze moving from the baby's mark to the mother's desperate eyes, now open and filled with a primal fear. She flinched, trying to pull the child closer, a protective growl too weak to be threatening caught in her throat. He said nothing for a long moment, simply observed. He saw not a witch, nor a harbinger of doom, but a woman pushed to the very edge of endurance, a mother fighting for her child's life. His gaze was not unkind, merely steady, assessing. He uncorked his canteen, poured a little water into the cupped palm of his hand, and offered it. She stared at it, then at him, suspicion warring with a desperate thirst. Slowly, hesitantly, she leaned forward and drank, her parched lips trembling. He offered more, until she leaned back, a sigh escaping her. "The child?" he asked, his voice raspy from disuse, yet not harsh. She looked down at Lyra, her expression a mixture of fierce love and profound sorrow. She needs," her voice was barely a whisper. He nodded. He understood. Without further words, he rose, went to his horse, and returned with a small water skin, its contents fresher. He helped her guide a few drops to the baby's lips. Lyra, after a moment of protest, began to suckle feebly. Silas watched, his expression unreadable. He saw the fine bones of the woman's wrist, the way her hands, though dirty, were gentle with the child. He saw the resilience flickering in the depths of her exhausted eyes. "My place," he said, the words blunt, an offer, not a plea. "It's not far." Shelter. She looked up at him, searching his face for a trick, for a hidden motive. She found only a quiet gravity. The alternative was to stay here, to let the night and the coyotes claim them. She had nothing left to lose but the tiny life in her arms. Slowly, she nodded, a single, almost imperceptible movement. He helped her to her feet, his touch surprisingly gentle as he steadied her. He then lifted her onto his horse, placing her carefully in the saddle, and then handed Lyra up to her. He took the reins and began to walk, leading the horse towards the west, towards the fading light and whatever semblance of safety his solitary homestead might offer. He did not ask her name, nor she his. The silence between them was vast, filled only with the plodding of hooves, the creak of leather, and the occasional, weak cry of the child. He glanced back once, seeing her slumped wearily, her face turned into the baby's blanket, shielding it from the cooling air. The mark on the child's brow was hidden now. To Silas, it was just a mark. The true curse, he reckoned, was the fear that lived in the hearts of men, the fear that could drive them to such cruelty. He walked on, a stoic protector leading his unexpected charges into the gathering dusk, a flicker of something akin to purpose stirring in a heart long accustomed to emptiness. The homestead was stark, a testament to one man's solitary toil against an unforgiving land. A small, sturdy cabin of rough-hewn logs, a lean-to barn, a fenced corral, and a patch of struggling garden. Smoke curled thinly from the stone chimney, a fragile plume against the vast, darkening sky. Silas led Ilara not to the cabin, but to the barn. It was clean, smelling of hay and horses, a more private, less assuming shelter. He gestured to a corner stall, freshly bedded with clean straw. "Here," he said. Warmer than outside, it was not an apology, nor an explanation, just a fact. Ilara slid from the horse, her legs weak, but she held Lyra securely. She looked at the straw, then at him, a silent question in her eyes. He merely nodded, then turned to tend to his horse, leaving her to settle. There was a bucket of fresh water near the stall, and a tin cup. A rough blanket lay folded on a wooden crate. Small comforts, but more than she had dared hope for. She sank onto the straw, the weariness so profound it was a physical ache. Lyra began to fuss, her hunger a persistent, tiny demand. Ilara's milk had begun to come, a painful, welcome sensation. She fumbled with her dress, her movements clumsy with exhaustion, and finally put Lyra to her breast. The baby latched on, her small body relaxing as she nursed. Ilara watched her, the fierce, protective love a burning ember in the ashes of her despair. The mark on Lyra's forehead seemed less stark in the dim light of the barn, more a shadow than a brand. Silas returned as dusk deepened into night. He carried a lantern, its flickering glow casting dancing shadows on the rough walls, and a wooden bowl filled with a simple stew of rabbit and root vegetables. He set it down near her, along with a hunk of dark bread. "Eat," he commanded softly, then retreated to the far side of the barn, busying himself with mending a piece of tack. He did not watch her, affording her a measure of privacy for which she was profoundly grateful. The food was warm, nourishing. She ate slowly, savoring each mouthful, feeling strength seep back into her limbs. Lyra slept now, nestled in the curve of her arm. The barn was quiet, save for the soft sounds of the animals, the occasional rustle of straw, the distant howl of a coyote, a sound that no longer seemed quite so terrifying now that there were walls, however humble, around them. Days melted into a quiet rhythm. Ilara rarely saw Silas up close. He would leave food and fresh water by the stall entrance in the early morning before he went out to work his land, and again in the evening. He never intruded, never asked questions. He spoke only when necessary, short, practical statements. "More wood for the fire," he'd say, gesturing to a small pile he'd left. Or, "Storm coming." "Best stay inside." Ilara, in turn, began to emerge from her shell of fear. She kept her corner of the barn meticulously clean. She found a discarded needle and thread in a rotting swill bag and mended the tears in her dress, then, tentatively, mended a rip in one of Silas's worn work shirts she found hanging on a peg. She left it folded neatly where he would find it. He said nothing when he took it, but the next day, a small, slightly bruised apple appeared beside her morning meal. She began to help in small ways. She swept the barn floor with a makeshift broom of twigs. She gathered eggs from the few scrawny chickens that scratched in the yard, leaving them in a basket by the cabin door. She learned the sounds of his routine, the clang of the pump handle, the rhythmic thud of his axe splitting wood, the quiet clink of tools as he worked on his fences. Lyra grew, her small face filling out, her eyes beginning to focus on the world around her. The mark remained, a silent question, but Ilara found herself looking at it less with fear and more with a strange kind of acceptance. It was part of her daughter, part of their story. Silas, on the rare occasions his work brought him near the barn when Lyra was awake, would sometimes pause. He never touched the child, never cooed or smiled in the way others might. But Ilara saw his gaze linger on the baby, a fleeting softness in his usually stern eyes before he would grunt, a sound that could mean anything, and move on. One evening, after a particularly harsh windstorm had rattled the barn through the night, Ilara found a small, roughly carved wooden bird on the crate beside her breakfast. Its lines were simple, unadorned, yet there was a surprising grace to its form. Her fingers traced its smooth, worn surface. It was a gift, an unspoken acknowledgement. She looked towards the cabin, but Silas was already gone, a distant figure mending a fence line near the creek. She held the bird to her cheek, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Trust was not a word spoken between them, but it was being built, moment by quiet moment, in shared solitude, in acts of service given and received without expectation or thanks. The land around them was harsh, but here, in this small, protected space, a fragile peace had begun to take root. The silence was no longer empty, it was filled with unspoken understanding, with the steady presence of another soul who, like her, knew the weight of loneliness and the quiet strength found in endurance. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke a language she was beginning to understand, a language of quiet care, of gruff protection. And for Ilara, who had known only condemnation and abandonment, it was more than enough. It was a lifeline. The fragile peace of their quiet cohabitation was always shadowed by the world beyond Silas's fence line. Ilara knew it, felt it in the way the wind sometimes carried the distant bark of a dog from redemption, or the faint toll of its church bell on a clear Sunday morning. These sounds were reminders of the judgment that lay waiting, a beast biding its time. Weeks turned into months. Lyra began to smile, her toothless grins a small sunbeam in their somber world. The mark on her forehead, though still distinct, seemed to Ilara to be softening, as if the love that surrounded her was slowly leaching the fear from its pigment. Silas remained a man of deep reserves, his words few, his presence a steady, grounding force. He had, without comment, moved an old rocking chair into the barn, its wood worn smooth with age. Ilara would sit there for hours, rocking Lyra, humming wordless lullabies, the creak of the chair a rhythmic counterpoint to the sounds of the farm. He had begun to leave small portions of whatever he cooked for himself by the cabin door in the evenings, an unspoken invitation for her to share his fare, which was always simple but nourishing. She, in turn, would sometimes leave a small pail of wild berries she'd gathered, or a few carefully darned socks. These small exchanges were their conversations, their acknowledgments of a shared existence. But the whispers from redemption had not died. They had festered, fueled by a summer drought that baked the valley fields and by a sickness that swept through the village, taking 2 of its older residents. Fear, once ignited, sought a scapegoat, and the memory of the blood eclipse child, the cursed one, was a convenient ember to fan into flame. One late afternoon, as the sky brooded with the promise of a long overdue storm, Ilara saw them. A small procession of figures on horseback, making their way slowly up the track towards Silas's homestead. Her heart lurched, a cold dread seeping into her veins. She recognized Elder Josiah, his stern face a mask of grim righteousness, and beside him, Thomas, the blacksmith, a man whose fear often manifested as bluster and aggression. There were others, their faces grim, their intent palpable even from a distance. She snatched Lyra from her makeshift crib, clutching the child to her breast, her eyes wide with terror. She retreated deeper into the shadows of the barn, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Silas was in the north pasture, mending a section of fence damaged by coyotes. He would not see them approach from this direction until it was too late. The riders drew up before the cabin, their horses restless, snorting and stamping. Elder Josiah dismounted, his movements stiff with age and self-importance. "Silas," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the heavy air. "Silas, come out. We know she is here." Ilara pressed herself against the rough wooden planks of the stall, Lyra whimpering softly against her neck. She tried to soothe the baby, her own body trembling uncontrollably. She could hear the heavy thud of boots as the men dismounted, the jingle of harness, the low murmur of their voices. Then, she heard Silas's voice, calm, level, from the direction of the pasture. "What do you want, Josiah?" He must have seen them, must have cut across the field. Ilara peeked through a crack in the boards. Silas stood near the corral, an axe held loosely in one hand, not as a weapon, but as a tool he had been using. He was covered in dust and sweat, his face unreadable. "We've come for the woman and the child," Josiah declared, his voice ringing with authority. "The marked one. She has brought ill fortune upon us. The drought, the sickness, it is her presence, her curse, that blights our valley. That's foolish talk, Josiah," Silas said, his voice still even, though Ilara could detect a new tightness in it. "A child is a child. There's no curse but the one you carry in your own hearts. Do not presume to preach to us, Silas." Thomas the blacksmith stepped forward, his face flushed. "We saw the mark. Born of the eclipse. It is an abomination. The good Lord is angry. We must cleanse this land of her taint." Other voices chimed in, a chorus of fear and accusation. "Give them to us, Silas. It's for the good of redemption. We won't have a witch breeding curses on our doorstep." Ilara's blood ran cold. Cleanse. The word was a death knell. She hugged Lyra tighter, burying her face in the baby's soft hair, trying to stifle her sobs. She could not let them take her child. She would fight, she would die, but she would not let them harm Lyra. The tension outside the barn was a palpable thing, thick and heavy as the storm clouds gathering overhead. She could hear Silas's silence, a deliberate, weighted pause before he spoke again. His next words would decide their fate. She prayed, a desperate, silent plea to any power that might listen, for strength, for mercy, for a miracle in this desolate place. The wind began to pick up, whistling through the eaves of the barn, carrying the first scent of rain. It sounded like a mournful sigh, a lament for the innocents about to be shattered. Silas stood his ground, the axe still loose in his hand, his gaze sweeping over the grim faces before him. He was not a man easily moved by the passions of others, nor by their fears. He had lived too long with the quiet truths of the earth, the cycles of life and death, to be swayed by superstition. He looked at elder Josiah, whose piety he had always found more performative than profound, and at Thomas, whose courage was loudest in a crowd. He saw not righteous men, but frightened sheep, bleating their terror. "This is my land," Silas stated, his voice low but carrying a new edge, like honed steel. "The woman and the child are under my protection." A murmur rippled through the group. Josiah's face hardened. "Protection? You would harbor a curse, Silas? Defy the will of the community? Defy God?" "Your God, perhaps, Josiah," Silas replied, his voice still quiet but resonating with an undeniable force. "My God doesn't brand infants with curses. He asks for mercy, for kindness to the stranger. Or have you forgotten those words in your haste to condemn?" Lyra, listening from the shadows of the barn, felt a surge of astonishment, then a fragile, burgeoning hope. He was defending them. This silent, solitary man was standing against an entire village for her, for Lyra. "She is a good woman," Silas continued, his gaze unwavering. Lyra's breath caught. He had never spoken of her, to her, in such terms. "She has harmed no one. She works hard, she tends her child with love. The baby." He paused, and for a fleeting moment, Lyra thought she saw a flicker of profound sorrow, of remembered pain, in his eyes. "The baby is innocent. Her mark is from nature, not from any evil nature. It is a sign, Silas. A warning." Thomas bellowed, stepping closer, his hand reaching for the cudgel tucked into his belt. "We will not be turned away by your blasphemy." Silas shifted his weight slightly, the movement almost imperceptible, yet it conveyed a readiness, a line drawn. The axe in his hand no longer looked like a mere tool. "This is where it ends, Thomas," Silas said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it cut through the rising wind. "You will not touch them. You will not set foot in that barn. You will leave my property." His words were not a request. They were a declaration, absolute and final. He was one man against six, but there was a power in his stance, in the quiet conviction of his voice, that gave them pause. He was a man who meant what he said, a man who had little, and therefore little to lose, but who would defend what he considered his with a ferocity they had not anticipated. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind howled, whipping dust into their faces. The first heavy drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the dry earth. Elder Josiah looked at Silas, then at the sky, then back at his men. He saw the wavering in their eyes, the dawning realization that Silas would not yield, that to press further meant violence, a violence perhaps none of them, not even Thomas, truly courted. "You are making a grave mistake, Silas," Josiah said, his voice laced with venom, but the certainty had gone out of it. "You will regret this. When further calamity befalls redemption, the blame will rest on your head as well." Silas did not reply. He simply stood there, a bulwark against their fear, his gaze steady. Slowly, reluctantly, Josiah turned and remounted his horse. One by one, the other men followed suit, some muttering curses, others casting fearful glances towards the barn. Thomas was the last, his face contorted with frustration and a grudging respect. He spat on the ground, then wheeled his horse and galloped away, the others following in his wake, their retreat hastened by the escalating storm. Silas watched them go, until they were small figures disappearing into the grey curtain of rain. Only then did he lower the axe, his shoulders slumping slightly, as if a great weight had been lifted. He turned towards the barn. Ilara slowly emerged from the shadows, Lyra still cradled in her arms. Her face was wet, not just from the rain that had begun to seep through the roof, but from tears. Tears of relief, of gratitude so profound it left her speechless. She looked at Silas, this quiet, gruff man who had just risked everything for them. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable as ever, yet she saw something new there, a connection forged in the crucible of shared crisis. He said nothing. She said nothing. The rain poured down, washing the dust from the air, washing away the immediate threat. It was enough. In the shelter of the barn, with the storm raging outside, a new kind of silence settled between them, no longer the silence of strangers, but the deep, resonant quiet of a family forged not by blood, but by courage, by kindness, by a shared stand against the darkness of the world. Years passed like the turning of seasons on Silas's homestead. The mark on Lyra's brow, once a symbol of fear and condemnation, faded slightly with time, becoming a unique tracery, like a delicate constellation. She grew into a bright, inquisitive child, her laughter echoing in the small cabin they now shared. For Silas had, with his characteristic lack of fanfare, moved Ilara and Lyra into the main house shortly after the confrontation. There were no pronouncements of love, no grand gestures, but his action spoke of a commitment deeper than words. He taught Lyra to identify birds by their song, to track animals by their prints, to read the stories written in the clouds. Ilara, her spirit healed, her quiet strength now a gentle radiance, made their house a home. The garden flourished under her care. The scent of baking bread often filled the air. She learned the rhythms of Silas's heart, the unspoken language of his soul. They were a family, bound by an unbreakable bond of shared experience and quiet devotion. Redemption kept its distance, the memory of Silas's stand a lingering deterrent. Some misfortune still befell the village, as misfortunes do everywhere, but no one dared openly blame the child on Silas's hill anymore. Perhaps, in their hearts, some even began to question the nature of curses, and the true meaning of grace. One summer evening, years later, Silas sat on the porch, Lyra, now a girl of 10, beside him, pointing out shapes in the clouds. Ilara came out, carrying a small, intricately carved wooden flower, its petals delicate and lifelike. She handed it to Lyra. It was a replica of the wildflowers that bloomed in their meadow each spring. Lyra's eyes lit up. "Did you make this, Papa Silas?" she asked, for so she had come to call him. Silas looked at Ilara, a rare, soft smile touching his lips. He nodded. "Your mother taught me," he said, his voice still gruff, but laced with a tenderness that spoke volumes. Ilara leaned against the porch railing, watching them, her heart full. The blood eclipse was a distant memory, its shadow vanquished by the steady light of love and acceptance. They had built a legacy, not of fear, but of resilience, a testament to the quiet courage it takes to choose kindness in a cruel world. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of peace, it was clear that the only mark that truly mattered was the indelible imprint of love they had left on each other's souls. You see, the stories we tell ourselves, the fears we entertain, they can become curses more potent than any mark on a child's skin. They can build walls between us, blind us to the humanity in others. But courage, the quiet courage to stand for what is right, to offer shelter to the outcast, to see worth where others see only blemish, that is a force that can break any curse. It's the courage to look past the surface, to listen to the whispers of your own heart rather than the shouts of the crowd. This family, born of a shadow and forged in defiance, reminds us that love is the truest sanctuary, and acceptance the most powerful blessing. Their story, like so many whispered on the winds of the Old West, is a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, hope can take root and flourish, if only we are brave enough to plant its seeds. Don't let the shadows of fear dictate your world. Choose to see the light in others. If their story touched your heart, share it, so that more may learn that compassion is the greatest mark of strength. Subscribe for more tales that seek the light in the darkness, and remember, the most beautiful legacies are built with love.